Okay, so this is the final TLC resource session of the fall semester of 2023. I am joined by Dr. Mark Scott. He and I today are going to provide some information about the process of backward design in curriculum development and some strategies for developing effective assignment prompts. So I'm going to start with just an overview. Kind of briefly, 10 to 15 minutes, we'll talk a little bit about what backward design is, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Scott to get into more specific strategies around developing effective assignment prompts. So to get started, I want to talk about backward design, specifically the stages of backward design, and give you just a little bit of background in terms of where all this is coming from. So McTeague and Wiggins in 2005 published a book called Understanding by Design, so a little less than 20 years ago, that really kind of started questioning some of the ways that we develop curriculum, particularly starting with our texts and our assignments without giving a lot of thought to how they connect to and relate to the outcomes that we want to see for our students, the skills that we want to see them develop through the class, the knowledge bases that we want to see them build throughout the process of the class. So McTeague and Wiggins identified 3 stages that we should go through to achieve this backward design process of curriculum development. And the first stage that we want to start with is those learning outcomes. So figuring out what is it that we want students to leave this class with. Again, what kind of skills do they need to have at the end of this class? What knowledge do we want to make sure they have at the end of this class? So that's the first thing to think about. What are those things that we want to achieve in this particular class? And then the next stage is identifying what's going to be acceptable evidence of the achievement of those skills or the gaining of that knowledge. So we're looking at things like how we're going to assess assignments, rubrics that we might be putting together to make sure that the artifacts that our students are creating are providing us with the information we need to have to judge whether or not those learning outcomes are being met in our courses. And then the very last thing that we do in this backward design process is start thinking about what kind of experiences are we going to incorporate, what kind of texts are we going to incorporate into our curriculum. So instead of the things that historically folks maybe started with, like this is the textbook I'm going to use, these are the assignments that I'm going to use in this class, we get to that at the end once we have gone through this backward design process of first identifying what the outcomes are that we want to achieve, how then we're going to gauge whether or not those outcomes have been met, and then based on all that kind of foundational knowledge, then we start thinking about what texts, what activities or assignments are going to get us or get our students to the point where they can create an artifact that is going to allow us to be able to gauge whether or not they've achieved the things that we want them to achieve in the course of the class. So the authors of that book identified what they called the twin sins of traditional design. So again, looking at traditional design as starting with the materials you're going to use in class, the activities, without having a clear sense of how those might connect to learning outcomes. And the twin sins that they focused on were activity-focused learning without real reflection on what that activity means. And I will say I'm a big fan of experiential learning. I absolutely love active learning, but all the research around experiential learning will tell you activity or experience without any opportunity to reflect on it and to make connections between the thing that you're doing and the learning outcomes or the goals of that activity, the benefits of that are very limited without that reflection process. So the authors talk about this idea of curriculum being hands-on without being minds-on. So the process of developing activities without not just you and your mind having a clear connection between what this activity means in the context of your overall learning outcomes, but you being able to explain that and convey that information to students. Students need to understand why they're doing this thing too and how it connects to what it is that you're trying to achieve in this class. And so part of the process for that, again, reflection. So I certainly don't think the authors, and I'm certainly not saying take active learning or experiential learning out of your curriculum. I think they're saying, and certainly what I'm saying is, make sure you're being cognizant of incorporating reflection processes into your active learning, experiential learning, and you're really conveying clearly to your students, hey, we're doing this because it's going to help you develop these particular skills. It's going to help you understand these things that are going to be important that I want to make sure you leave this class with, for example. The other of the twin sins that McTeague and Wiggins mentioned is coverage-based curriculum. So really focusing on the content, the text that you want to use without really thinking necessarily how closely related that content might be to the learning outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And again, not communicating that connection to your students. So if you've just got them reading a textbook without spending some time in class talking through, hey, we're reading this because it provides you with some foundational knowledge that's going to allow you to do this thing that I want you to be able to do, that's going to be important for you to take out of this class. It's going to, here's the connection between what we're reading and what I'm asking you to do in this class, and ultimately the skills and knowledge that I hope you leave this class with. So again, just making sure you're being explicit in your conversations with students about why we're reading the things that we're reading, how it connects to our assignments, how it connects to the learning outcomes from the class, all those sorts of things. So just to talk about briefly learning outcomes, many of you may already be aware of this idea of SMART learning outcomes. And in this backward design process, you start with kind of maybe a broad idea of these are some things that I want to see my students achieve in this class. These are my priorities in this class. But when you get to the point of creating your learning outcomes, you want to start refining those broad ideas to help you be able to develop a meaningful rubric, and then in turn to help you be able to develop effective assignment prompts that are going to allow your students to create artifacts that are going to meet that rubric. So the SMART learning outcomes, this is from Skirbick and Burrows. They focus on these five kind of areas to focus on as you are developing your specific learning outcomes for a class. So the first is be specific. So it can be easy to say something broad like, I'm going to provide an example here in just a few moments from my introduction to communication class. So a broad learning outcome that I might have is I want my students to understand communication theory, right? That's big. That's a lot to try to understand, to try to capture in a specific assignment or in a rubric. So you want to kind of focus those broader goals and be more specific about exactly what you want the students to achieve. You want to make these things measurable. So you want to be able to look at the artifact that your student creates and be able to gauge from that, was this learning outcome achieved by the student? At what level was it achieved? That sort of thing. When we get into assessment, we often talk about quantitative assessment and numerical assessment. When we talk about measurable, I, as a person with a quantitative background, I think you can measure things in ways that are not numerical. So I don't think as you're developing your learning outcomes, it doesn't have to be something as simple as percentages or numbers or things like that. I think you can take a more qualitative approach and certainly use your judgment to identify, can I see students achieving these things that I want to see them achieve? And then the third point, achievable. So is this something that is realistic for students in this class? Is this something that you can accomplish based on the level of the students, based on their maybe prior academic experience related to the topic, those sorts of things? So you want to be realistic about what a student can truly achieve in the class that you're offering. You want to make sure that your learning outcomes are relevant to the topic of the class, and again, to those broad goals that you have for your students to leave the class with. And then finally, time bound is the fifth element that they talk about in terms of smart learning outcomes. And that just means, is this something realistically that can be achieved in the course of a semester, in the course of 7 weeks, depending upon, you know, what the time period you have to work with your students. So kind of thinking through those 5 things as you are refining your learning outcomes will make it, I think, easier for you to develop a strong rubric, and from that point to be able to develop effective assignment prompts to allow your students to create artifacts that will allow you to use that rubric. So I just quickly want to talk about, most of us probably are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. This is helpful to me when I'm developing my learning outcomes in terms of thinking about where I am with the class. So as I said, I'm going to give you an example from COM 1000, which is our kind of foundational course in the COM major, the communication major. So I want to think about not necessarily the things at the top of this pyramid or this kind of hierarchy of learning. I want to think about kind of some things maybe around the middle. It's a major course, but it is an introductory major course, and so we're starting to build some foundations for later courses. So as you'll see, I'm focused really on that application level. One of the things I like about Bloom's is it gives you some specific verbs to think about when you're developing your learning outcomes. It helps you think about, okay, so if I'm writing a learning outcome, what kind of action am I focused on? And Bloom's helps you kind of think about what level you're at with this class, what your outcomes might be, and then more specifically helps you to come up with some of that language to identify what it is that you want to achieve in that particular class. So I just find it helpful. So again, I'm going to finish up with just a quick example of how I use backward design in the process of developing. I'm just going to talk about one learning outcome and its relationship to one assignment in COM 1000. So again, this is Introduction to Communication. It is a first-year major course in the communication major. And the content of the course it's a survey of communication theories. So I'm trying to ground students in a range of theories related to interpersonal communication, group and organizational communication, social influence, mass communication, culture and communication, all those sorts of things. I'm just trying to get them grounded in some kind of concepts that they'll return to in later courses in the major. So just to kind of walk through how I went through the stages of design for this particular assignment and this particular learning outcome in the class, I started with, I knew I wanted students to be able to take these concepts that we were talking about and think about what they looked like in various scenarios, real life scenarios. So the learning outcome I came up with, again, that kind of mid-range of Bloom's taxonomy, I want them to be able to apply theoretical premises to lived or observed communication events. So I want them to be able to look at things, their own interactions with people, things they see in TV and on the movies and books, all those sorts of things, and think about how are these theoretical concepts enacted in these different situations. So I start with that learning outcome. From that point, I start thinking about a rubric and start thinking about, okay, what do I need to see in an artifact from them that will allow me to determine whether or not or how well they're achieving this particular learning outcome. And so I came up with a few rubric elements that I felt like would give me the information that I needed to be able to make that judgment. The first is I wanted them to be able to provide me an overview of the communication-based scenario. So I need them to be able to tell me what's going on in this communication-based scenario. From that point, I would like for them to be able to identify and explain a few theoretical concepts that are actually applicable to that scenario. So take a theory and within that theory, think about some premises or think about some ideas that are fundamental to that theory and be able to identify this is a concept that I can see in action in this particular scenario, and explain what that concept is to me. And then from there, I want you to be able to provide a detailed explanation of how that concept applies to the theory. So talking about what specifically is happening in this interaction that you see as relevant to that theoretical concept that you introduced, and explaining how it is connected to that. And then finally, this is a communication class. I want you to be able to convey your ideas in a way that's going to be easy for people to follow and understand. So the fourth element of my rubric is I want you to be able to organize the elements of your submission in a way that's clear and accessible, that I can follow, to make sure that I'm understanding the information you're trying to share with me. So I have that rubric, I have that idea in mind. And then the next step, and we want to make sure we're not forgetting this step, is to develop an assignment that allows you, or allows the students to meet kind of the outcomes that you're trying to seek, and to show you through that artifact that they're creating how they are achieving that thing. So you do need to provide some kind of explicit instructions. You can't just like say, hey, here's the rubric, here's what I want to see, and leave them kind of floundering in terms of, okay, like, how do I do that? What is the thing that I need to create? So a couple of elements of the assignment, just broadly, I ask students to choose 3 concepts from the theories that we studied in a particular unit in the class. And so we break it down into interpersonal communication, a unit on that, a unit on group and org communication, unit on culture and communication, a unit on social influence, and a unit on mass communication. So for each of the units, I asked students to do this application assignment. And for each unit, I wanted them to identify 3 concepts that they were introduced to in our readings within that unit, and then apply it to a scenario of their choice, showing me those things that I'm looking for in that rubric. And so just to kind of show you what that assignment looks like, you can see I provide some kind of detailed information from some background information. I give them a couple of options. You can either develop an imaginary scenario, so make up a situation in which you can apply these concepts, or you can choose an event that is a real event. So an experience that you've had or that you've observed, something that you've seen in media or something like that. From there, detailed introductions on, this is how I want you to provide an overview of the scenario. I want to understand what the relationships between people are. I want to understand the setting. I want to understand all the factors that might be relevant to the theoretical concepts that you're using. And so I spell all that out. That's in the syllabus, but we also talk about it multiple times in class. So we talk about it on the first day of class as we're going through the syllabus. As the deadline for the first assignment approaches, we spend some time again talking about it in class when I introduce the rubric and try to like help them see this is how the assignment connects to the rubric and the way I'm going to be grading the submission that you make. And then actually one of the things that we did in class right before the first one was due is we went through an exercise that simulated this. So I asked the students to come up with 3 concepts from the unit that we were working on, and then together we developed a scenario and talked through how each of those concepts applied to that scenario. So again, just being very explicit in conveying information to your students about what it is that you want to see from them and how it connects to the content of the class and the exercises, all those sorts of things. And that is kind of my overview. So I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen now and turn things over to Dr. Scott.
Chrissy, can you put up your slides again and go to the slide before the one you just ended with? So this slide here, I kind of want to take a second to pause, especially for folks that are newer to teaching. This slide right here, I think if you're trying to think like, all right, how do I develop lesson plans and how do I kind of like structure my time over a unit so you know what the end goal is? But what are the steps that you take to kind of flesh that out and get students ready for that end goal? This list of items here, like in the rubric elements and the assignments, those are all things that you can have students practice. Those are like many things that you can do in a class. You can have conversations about organization and different organization schemas. You can talk about what it means to have a detailed explanation. So um, the backwards planning step, like it's front loading a lot of work, but it's also work and labor that is going to save you time in the long run. And it helps kind of like, where is this class going over the next 3 or 4 weeks? Doing this stuff ahead of time, it really does kind of add some cohesion to a class or to a unit and an assignment. And you're able to kind of explain to students how things are connected, and things don't feel like busy work if you're able to connect everything back to that major assignment. So I love this slide here, the stages of design, because it's all aligning to this larger goal that's articulated here, but I'm also able to see like, okay, I know what the next few weeks of this class are going to be about. It's going to be taking a look at these different theoretical concepts and looking at them in different contexts and practicing that and maybe playing with organization and yeah, like so I think this slide's super helpful and being able to list that stuff out for yourself when you're developing your class and even before you start writing a prompt, that's super helpful. One thing I would add here, in some classes, you have to think about what is the stuff that I have to teach and what is the stuff that I'm assuming that students already know. And I've had conversations with folks that teach writing, and sometimes the things that we assume that students know, they actually have to be things that you have to teach sometimes. So um, knowing what your expectations are, communicating those to students, kind of testing out and knowing where they are so you can say, well, you know what, we need to spend some time on paragraph development or something like that. Super helpful slide here. Thank you for putting that up, Christy. So I in the chat, and we'll try to get this shared on make this available for folks. There's a handout around designing effective writing assignments, and there's some research and some scholarship out there about what an effective writing assignment looks like and what are some effective strategies for um, an assignment prompt. So I'm just going to kind of summarize some of that scholarship, and then there's some links in that handout that you can take a look at. There's some open educational resources that you can click on that'll take you to some sources I found really helpful. So um, prompt is in a writing assignment, you're doing three things really. You're defining the task, you are exploring the expectations that you have for that task, and then you are identifying some resources, some things that students can point to, like if they get a little bit stuck. So a good prompt addresses those three things. The handout kind of elaborates on those a little bit. So an effective prompt, it should clarify some logistics. When is an assignment due? Word count, things like that. Are there opportunities for students to revise? Are there opportunities for them to check in with you? Those are really important. There's things that students look for immediately when they take a look at a prompt. How much is this worth? What's the word requirement? Things like that. Students do want to see that stuff. That they're going to read the rest of it. They should read the rest of it, but they're really looking for those logistics, due dates, things like that. I use a call out box sometimes when I have prompt, particularly for first year students. That like quick facts about assignment one, and here's the due date. We're going to do a peer review on this date, and like those logistics, putting those clearly articulating those for students. Um, you want to provide some choice for students, and you saw that in Christie's example. Students can choose the context that they're looking at. Like they can look at a communication interpersonal, they can look at something in media, social media. Like that's a great example of like you're providing students a little bit of agency to um, do to make a choice that I'm going to satisfy this learning outcome, but I'm going to be able to choose how I go about doing that. And there's research out there that says that if you're able to provide students context in which they feel more familiar or they feel like they have a little bit more mastery, it's less intimidating for them and they often succeed a little bit better. So if you are having students apply a concept that is particularly new, that might be a little bit intimidating to them, getting them to start out maybe an early assignment where you are getting them to look at that concept um, in a on their home turf, like in a context that they feel a little bit more comfortable. Students are able to engage a little bit more uh, with those kind of assignments. So providing choice, and that even gets to like, does everything really need to be an essay? Maybe not. Are there different ways that different media that students can use to show you that they've learned something? So thinking about that ahead of time and, preparing for the logistics of that, like what that would look like if you use Blackboard a lot, like is Blackboard, am I going to be able to collect all this work through Blackboard? Um, but giving students some choice, even if it's like, choose these 2 or 3 items or ways or paths to approach this assignment. It, Students feel like they have more agency when they're able to make a choice. You want to clarify the purpose and the audience for the writing. And this goes for any, like across the curriculum. If you're teaching in the sciences or business, you want to provide students, you want to clarify the purpose and you want to be clear about the audience that students are writing for. You are definitely, as the instructor, you are definitely an audience for that writing. But being clear about when it comes time for you to evaluate that writing, um, are you the intended audience? Are the peers the intended audience? Are you asking students to imagine that they're writing a business proposal for some kind of, some imaginary organization? Like being really clear about who they're writing to and giving students some clarity about that helps them kind of imagine, all right, what are the expectations of this audience that I'm writing to? So an assignment prompt that says, here's here's who you're trying to communicate to, clarifying that, it helps them make rhetorical choices that are more appropriate for what it is you're looking for. Um, I think a prompt can also identify resources. In doing this, I mean, sometimes they'll say, you want to take a look on the Purdue OWL if you have questions about this issue, or there's this other resource if you're new to this concept. But I think you can also point to things that you're going to do over the next few weeks. Like we have a really important lesson on this concept. It's really important for you for this assignment. That putting that on students' radar that they know when, like, oh, everything's kind of planned out here. Like I really do need to attend these days. I need to participate and, check in on Blackboard because there are these resources that my instructor has called out and said these are going to help you succeed on this assignment. So pointing students to identify resources, it gets them a little bit more engaged. I think it's something you can point to show that, again, this isn't all busy work. Like, these things all kind of matter. These practice things that we're going to do, these, this presentation that I'm going to give you about this concept, it all kind of matters because it's tied to and dovetails with this larger assignment that you're going to do in the class. And that larger assignment is kind of tied to the the goals of the class as a whole. So pointing to some resources in your prompt can be a helpful way to add some cohesion to the assignment. I think you want to, a good prompt, I think, also connects with students. It connects with what you've already done in a class. So if you're talking about assignment towards the end of a class, you can kind of point to what students have already learned in the class and how it has prepared them for what it is you're going to ask them to do. You can also talk about learning that they've had in if we're talking about a class that has a prerequisite, like, you've probably learned this in this first class and, we're building upon this for this assignment, connecting with students and where they are and what they've already done in the class is again, another way to add some cohesion to the assignments that you're assigning. You could also talk a little bit about, and I've done this with like when I teach the capstone course, I'm able to kind of point to like, here's how this learning is going to apply in the future. Um, Here's what you might be able to do with this in the future. You might be able to use this for a grad school application, or this writing can have a life outside of this class. Like I'm using this so that you can show me that you've obtained the learning objectives, but that doesn't have to be the only place where this writing and these concepts can live. Like they're actually applicable and useful outside of this class. And using the prompt, you can use the prompt to explain that a little bit. I would also think, and I'm a big proponent of this, you want to convey information in a prompt in a way that students get. Like, write it for students. Um, and this is something I have to think about. And it sometimes takes a little bit of user testing. Like I've shared prompts with folks that I know. If there's a student in a class, I'll say like, hey, I'm thinking about this for the next assignment. What do you think? Getting their response to it. If they have any question marks, if they're like, hey, I'm not so sure about this, kind of take that part back to the drawing board. But you write a prompt in language that students understand. And I say that the rubric and the learning outcomes, they should also be written in ways that students can understand, so that they know how they're being evaluated and there's not a bait and switch later on, like when it comes time to grade, they're on board, or at least they're maybe not on board, but they understand what's going on with that assignment and they're responding appropriately. So writing that prompt in language that students understand. And I think even I'm not Chuck Davis when it comes to document design, but I try to implement document design, particularly in prompts, to draw students' attention to things that I think are important. And in the last slide in Christie's presentation, there's that bulleted list that that our eyes go right there. That like, okay, there's something important that's going on here because this visual cue is different from what else I'm seeing here. So using bulleted list, not bearing important details in a large paragraph. I think that being smart about how you've designed a prompt. I think that those are good recommendations. I am gonna, if I can, share my screen. I came up with a sample prompt that's kind of a little bit meta, but I'd like to share it with y'all so I can kind of point out some of these concepts that I've just talked about. So let me try that now. Here we go. So imagine that we are in the Teaching and Learning Center. Christy and I have just given this presentation about effective writing assignments. I would get folks together and say, hey, sketch out an assignment. Um, do this backwards planning thing. Think a little bit about it. Think about a learning outcome for your class and kind of list out what is, the logistics of the assignment, the kind of the many things that you would need to teach students, maybe the assumptions that you have, what students already know. And then we'll get together kind of at the end of the session and we'll share it out. So this prompt implements several of the strategies that I've mentioned here. It articulates what students are going to submit. It's going to be an informal presentation at the end of the session. So the logistics are there. There's a little bit of choice there. You get to choose the learning outcome, maybe choose the class that you're thinking about. So a little bit of choices in there as well. Who's the audience? Your students. You're thinking about the assignment for your students, but then there's also this double audience, like you're going to present this to your colleagues. So there's some information about who you're actually pitching this to. The resources. Refer to your notes, this prompt, and the PowerPoint slides I distributed. So I didn't have PowerPoint slides. I apologize for that. But here are the things that you can point to and say, if you get a little bit stuck, you can go back to that, or you can raise a hand and I would come around. So you, you have a sense of like where you can go again if you're stuck. Connect with students. I think that this is written in language that folks can pretty much get. There's no complicated jargon or anything like that. Yeah, and the design element, these are the things that I'm really looking for. So if we were to do this and I was listening to folks kind of present, I'd be looking like, all right, have you aligned this imaginary assignment that you brainstormed? Have you aligned that with the bigger outcome of a course? Like that alignment is important, and we would kind of walk through that a little bit. And I would ask folks to kind of explain how is this assignment really kind of connected to that bigger thing that you want students to learn? Are you able to kind of connect that assignment to what students already know? Are you able to explain the significance of that assignment to students? Are there some logistics that you've thought about? How are they going to submit that? Are you going to provide them some choice in how they submit that? And then I'm also letting folks know that I also want to see, like, are you pointing to resources students can use. So I'm trying to be clear there using some design elements like here's the things that I'm really kind of looking for. I think students want to see that. They're like, okay, and you'll get this as an instructor. What are you looking for, Dr. Scott? It's in the prompt. What are you really looking for, Dr. Scott? It's bold in the prompt. So using some design to kind of help answer some questions. And again, and I think Christy mentioned this several times, like the prompt does not settle the questions. You have to reinforce that throughout, the weeks that you're teaching this assignment. So, you're coming back to that prompt, clarifying things, and then connecting things back to those goals that you've articulated in the prompt. But that's why I wanted to share with y'all in terms of the designing effective writing assignment prompts. There's a couple resources that I just want to draw to your attention. Tracy Gardner's design writing assignments. It's written for folks regardless of the discipline, and it's super accessible. It's a super quick read. Chapter 3 is really, and it's an OER, so it's free to download. Also, I want to draw folks' attention to Prompt, a journal of academic writing assignments. Again, this is across the curriculum. So there's science, there's social sciences, business, folks in the humanities. There's folks that have shared their prompts and kind of reflected on the assignments that they put together. This is an excellent resource. It's been around for a few years, and they do really cool stuff in there. And then the National Writing Project, they also had a report on effective writing assignments, written mostly for high school, but I think that there's some useful lessons in there as well. So some useful resources to take a look at if you want to learn more about writing effective prompts. And that's what I had to share, Christy.
Great, thank you so much. I do want to just kind of harken back to what you were saying about providing students choice. So one of the things that I didn't really talk about, but that I do with the assignment that I used as an example here, and actually have done in multiple classes, is I allow students to choose whether to submit their assignment as an essay, as a narrated PowerPoint, as kind of a podcast style audio file, or as a video. And the response from students has been really great. I've had students who come into the class immediately like super psyched that they can use that audio file. In terms of my course evaluation, so last semester, a course that I kind of introduced that into, I had a student talking about the accessibility component of that and how feeling like he didn't even really have to talk to me so much about his accessibility needs because it was kind of built into the assignment. So I think there are multiple benefits of thinking about how you can provide more options to students. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that might be. Dr. Jenna Scott, do you have any questions about anything we talked about or any thoughts, insights?
I think I would also just maybe say, because I've been looking at a lot of prompts of our grad students' portfolios, I think thinking about the sequence of information in the prompt when you're presenting it is also important. What I've kind of settled on is thinking about the order in which students are going to complete the assignment. So, where do they start? What do they need to think about along the way? And then what things are they going to do maybe a little bit more toward the end? So things like the purpose of the assignment, the genre, the audience, that is going to be at the top. Some of the steps or process is going to be more in the middle, and the specifications are going to be more at the end. That's your stuff that's how long does it need to be? What format does it need to be in? Those are things that students are probably going to focus on a little bit more toward the end as they're polishing it up. And so I tend to try to put those things in later. If you have things kind of scattered through the prompt, it's harder for students to figure out what they're supposed to do.
That's a great insight. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you, both Dr. Mark Scott and Dr. Jen Scott, for being with us today. And as always, there will be a recording available of this. I will send that out with my TLC email next week. So thank you all. And we'll be continuing to have coffee and conversations for a few more sessions throughout the course of the semester. And I will provide detailed information about what our topics will be for those. So hope to see folks there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.